Corinna Sterling had not slept properly in 11 days, and tonight would not be the 12th. She bent low over her workbench, one eye pressed to a brass loop, coaxing a stubborn escapement wheel back into its housing with tweezers no thicker than a needle. The candle beside her had burned down to a stub, and somewhere behind her, the shop's grandfather clock ticked out 11:30 with the same patient indifference it had shown every night since her father built it. Oak Haven slept beyond her shuttered windows. She did not. This was the life she had built for herself after leaving the Vance estate 3 years ago. Small, exacting, entirely her own. No Lord Steward looking over her shoulder, no family expecting her to bend the truth of a ledger to suit their convenience. Just gears and time and the quiet satisfaction of making broken things whole again. The escapement wheel clicked into place. She exhaled, set down her tools, and reached for her tea. Gone cold an hour ago, though she drank it anyway. That was when something struck her back door hard enough to rattle the hinges. Corinna froze, cup halfway to her lips. Oak Haven's Harbor Street was not a place for casual visitors past midnight, and certainly not for anyone fool enough to pound on a locked door with that much force. She set the cup down without a sound and reached for the iron poker resting beside her hearth, more out of habit than real fear. The knock came again, worse than before. Not a knock so much as a body falling against wood. She crossed the workshop in 6 quick steps, poker raised, and threw back the bolt. Gideon Vance nearly fell through the doorway. He caught himself against the frame, and for a moment Corinna simply stared, unable to reconcile the man in front of her with the one she remembered. His fine gray coat, the kind tailored for a gentleman who never had to think twice about the cost of anything, was soaked through and torn at one shoulder. His cravat hung loose around his throat, like something already given up on. He smelled of brandy so strongly that it reached her even from 3 feet away, and beneath that, something sharper, fear perhaps, though she had never once in her life imagined Gideon Vance capable of it. In his arms he clutched a heavy velvet bag, holding it the way a man might hold something he'd sooner die than drop. "Corinna." His voice cracked on her name, rough with drink and something rawer underneath. God help me, I need your hands." She lowered the poker, though she did not set it down. "You have some nerve, showing your face here." "I know it." He swayed, caught the doorframe again. "I know what I am to you. I know what my family did. I wouldn't have come. I swear to you I wouldn't have come if there were anyone else left." "Left for what?" Gideon's eyes, glassy with brandy and something closer to grief, found hers. "My father is gone, Corinna. A fortnight past. And I can't do this anymore. The lying, the waiting, watching my uncle carve up everything my father built as though I were already buried beside him." His grip on the velvet bag tightened. "There's a box, his last box, locked tighter than anything I've ever seen, and I haven't the first notion how to open it. But you would. You're the only one in this county who could." Behind him, the wind carried the first fat drops of rain, sweeping in off the harbor, striking the cobblestones in a rising patter. Corinna barely noticed. 3 years fell away in an instant. The humiliation of being dismissed from the Vance estate, the whispered accusations Lord Thaddeus had spread about her honesty, the ruin of a reputation she'd spent a lifetime building. She had promised herself she would never again let that family into her life. And yet here he stood, undone and desperate, asking for the one thing she had left to give. "Pursuers," he said, before she could speak. "Men my uncles paid. They've been a day behind me since Wraithmore. If they find this box before I do, what needs doing with it?" He didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. Corinna looked past him, out into the dark street, half expecting to see shapes moving between the buildings already. Nothing stirred but the rain, harder now, hissing against the shop's small windows. She should have shut the door. Every sensible instinct told her to shut the door, bolt it, and go back to her cold tea and her escapement wheels, and let the Vance family tear itself apart without her. Instead, she stepped back and pulled the door wider. Get inside before someone sees you standing there like a drowned fool. Gideon didn't move at first, as though he hadn't quite believed she would let him in. Then he stumbled past her, into the warm, candle-lit clutter of her workshop, and set the velvet bag down on her workbench with the careful reverence of a man laying a coffin to rest. Corinna bolted the door behind him and turned to look at the bag, and at the man who had once cost her everything, now standing dripping on her floor with nowhere else in the world left to go. Whatever's inside that bag, she said quietly, had better be worth what it's about to cost the both of us. Gideon met her eyes, and for the first time that night, something steadied in his voice. It's the truth, Corinna, the whole truth of what my uncle's done, and it's the only thing standing between me and losing everything my father ever built. Outside, the rain kept falling, and somewhere beyond the harbor road, men on horseback were already drawing closer. Gideon Vance did not last another quarter hour on his feet. Corinna managed to steer him toward the narrow bench along her workshop wall before his legs gave out entirely, and there he slumped, coat still dripping, muttering something about his father's handwriting before the brandy finally claimed him whole. She stood over him a moment, arms crossed, feeling foolish for the small pang of tenderness that rose in her chest at the sight of him so undone. 3 years ago, she would have called it impossible. The cold, composed air of the Vance estate reduced to a heap of wet wool and grief on her workshop bench. Now she only pulled a spare blanket from her cupboard and threw it over him, because whatever else he was still a man who had walked through a storm to reach her door. Then she turned her attention to the bag. She untied the velvet cord with careful fingers and drew out a box unlike anything she had handled in years of clock repair. It was brass, heavier than its size suggested, its surface engraved with a pattern of interlocking circles that, on closer study through her loop, resolved into the teeth of hidden gears. 2 separate locks sat side by side along its front edge, a double-barrel mechanism, she realized, meaning whoever built it had wanted 2 keys, 2 hands, or 2 minds working in concert to open it. She turned it slowly under the candlelight, searching for a seam, and found instead a small glass vial fitted into the box's inner lining, visible only through a narrow gap where the hinge met the lid. Her stomach turned cold. She recognized the design at once, though she had only ever read of it in her father's old journals, a defense mechanism favored by certain wealthy families who did not trust their heirs, or their enemies, to handle sensitive documents with patience. Force the lock, or guess the sequence wrong too many times, and the vial would shatter, flooding the box's interior with a corrosive acid strong enough to reduce paper to ash within moments. Whatever lay inside was meant to survive only for the person clever enough or patient enough to open it properly. She did not sleep the rest of that night. She sat beside the box with her tools spread across a cloth, studying the lock face by candlelight until the black windows of her workshop turned faintly gray with dawn. Gideon stirred not long after, groaning as he pushed himself upright, one hand pressed to his temple. For a moment he looked at her with the confused blankness of a man uncertain whether the night before had been real or imagined. Then his eyes found the box on her workbench, and everything in his face sharpened at once. "You didn't open it," he said, half question, half relief. "I'm not a fool," Corinna said, without looking up from the lock mechanism. "This thing has a self-destruct vial built into the hinge. Force it, or guess wrong more than twice, and whatever's inside turns to ash before either of us can read a word of it." Gideon went very still. "My father built it himself." "I should have guessed he wouldn't make it simple. Then perhaps you'd better tell me why I'm risking my hands on a box designed to punish curiosity." He rubbed his face, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost the slur of brandy, replaced by something flatter and more exhausted. "My father died a fortnight ago. Sudden, his heart," the physician said, "though I've since begun to wonder. 3 days after we buried him, my uncle produced a will, a new one, dated the very week before my father's death, naming Thaddeus sole executor of the estate until such time as he judges me, his words, fit to inherit." Corinna finally looked up. Fit to inherit. "And who decides that?" "He does, of course." Gideon's jaw tightened. "There's no fixed term, no condition I might satisfy. It's a leash, with no end to it, and everyone at the reading knew it, though none dared say so aloud, with Thaddeus standing there, dabbing his eyes over a brother he never once wrote to in 15 years. "You think the will is forged? I know it is. My father would never have written such a thing, not in 1,000 years. He thought Thaddeus a coward and a spendthrift, and told me so more times than I can count." Gideon nodded toward the box. "But he was careful, my father. He always was. I believe the true will is inside there, along with whatever proof he gathered against my uncle before he died. He told me once, half in jest, that if anything ever happened to him, the truth would be waiting in his study, locked and safe from anyone without the patience to earn it." Corinna studied the lock again, turning the loop over the first barrel. "This isn't jest work. Whoever built this understood clockwork better than most tradesmen I've trained beside. The tension on this ring alone would take a careful hand a full day to unwind without triggering the vial." "Then it's fortunate," Gideon said quietly, "that I know exactly whose hands are careful enough." She did not answer that directly. Instead, she reached for her finest tension pick, turning it once between her fingers before setting it against the first barrel's edge. "I'll need my full kit from the back room. Proper light, my magnifying stand, tools. I can't work half of this with what's spread across this bench." "Then we'll fetch them." Gideon rose, unsteady but resolved, the blanket falling from his shoulders. "Whatever it costs you, Corinna, I'll see it repaid. My father's justice is inside that box, and so, I think, is yours." Corinna set the loop down and met his eyes for the first time since he'd collapsed onto her bench the night before. "Justice," she said slowly, "isn't why I'm doing this. Not yet. Prove to me it's worth the risk first, and then we'll speak of what's owed." By midday, Corinna had gathered what she needed from the back room, her finest tension picks, a set of magnifying lenses fitted to a brass stand, and a roll of soft cloth to cushion the cipher box during transport, should it come to that. She had not yet decided whether it would. Part of her still wanted to send Gideon Vance back out into the rain and wash her hands of the whole affair. But the box sat on her bench now like a question she could not walk away from unanswered, and there was no undoing that. She was measuring the width of the first lock barrel when Gideon, standing near her front window with a cup of tea he'd barely touched, went suddenly rigid. "Corinna." Something in his voice made her set down her instruments at once. She crossed to the window and looked past the edge of the curtain, down onto the cobbled harbor street below. Two men stood outside the fishmonger's stall 3 doors down, dressed in heavy traveling cloaks, entirely wrong for a quiet Oakhaven afternoon, the sort of wool meant for long rides through open country, not a fishing town where most men wore oilskin and canvas. One of them was speaking to the fishmonger's boy, gesturing with his hand in a way that made the boy shake his head and point vaguely up the street. The other stood a little apart, scanning the row of shop fronts with the patient, methodical attention of a man conducting a search rather than simply passing through. "Do you know them?" Corinna asked quietly. "No, but I know the look of them." Gideon's cup had stopped halfway to his mouth. "My uncle keeps men like that on retainer. Not soldiers, not quite. The sort who ask questions in taverns and never seem to need sleep. If they're here, it means Thaddeus already knows I fled toward the coast. They're asking after you at the fishmonger's. They'll ask at every shop on this street before the hour's out." He set the cup down with a hand that was no longer entirely steady. "And a workshop with a locked back door, and a woman who once served the Vance household won't take them long to find, once someone mentions your name." Corinna's stomach tightened, though she kept her voice even. "Then we don't wait for them to find it." She moved quickly after that, years of disciplined habit taking over where fear might otherwise have slowed her. The cipher box went into her sturdiest leather satchel, wrapped first in cloth, then cushioned further with a folded apron to keep it from shifting. Her finest tools followed: the tension picks, the lupe, a small vial of clock oil she suspected she'd need before this was finished. She left the rest of her workshop exactly as it stood, half-built clocks and all, because a hurried departure that looked hurried would only confirm whatever suspicions those men already carried. "Change out of that coat," she told Gideon, already crossing to the trunk where she kept her late father's old clothes, things she'd never had the heart to give away. "Anyone searching for a gentleman in Vance gray won't look twice at a man in a dockworker's coat." Gideon didn't argue. He shed the ruined gray wool without ceremony and pulled on the plain brown coat she handed him, along with a flat cap that hid most of his face when he tilted his chin down. It was, Corinna thought, a strange sort of transformation to watch. The heir of one of the county's oldest estates disappearing into the clothes of a man who'd spent his life mending harbor nets. "There's a passage," she said, fastening the satchel's straps across her chest. "Beneath the street. The merchants along this row use it to move goods between the cellars without hauling everything through the shop fronts in bad weather. My father showed me the entrance years ago when I was a girl small enough to fit through the gap without stooping. And now we'll manage." She led him toward the back of the workshop, where a section of the floor beneath an old workbench lifted away to reveal a narrow set of stone steps descending into darkness. She took a candle from the wall sconce before they went down, shielding the flame with her cupped hand. The passage beneath the street was cold and close, smelling of damp stone and old brine, the sort of place Corinna had not walked through since her father passed. Roots from some long-dead tree had broken through the ceiling in one stretch, forcing them both to duck low, satchels scraping against rock. Gideon said nothing the whole way, though she could hear his breathing behind her, quick and controlled, the sound of a man holding himself together by will alone. They emerged through a cellar door, 2 streets over, behind a rope-maker's shop, long since shuttered for the evening trade. Corinna extinguished the candle and peered out into the alley beyond, finding it empty save for a stray cat picking through discarded fish bones. "Clear," she murmured. Gideon exhaled behind her, the first full breath he seemed to have taken since the window. "You saved us both a great deal of trouble just now." "I saved my workshop from being searched," Corinna said, stepping out into the gray afternoon light. Whether I've saved either of us any real trouble remains to be seen. Your uncle's men found this town in less than a day, Gideon. Wherever we go next, we'd best move faster than that. Gideon adjusted the cap low over his brow and fell into step beside her. Then we'll need a way inland, and quickly. My father kept a solicitor near the capital, a man I trust, if anyone in this county can still be trusted. If we can reach him before Thaddeus finalizes the estate transfer, there may yet be time to stop this properly. Corinna glanced once more over her shoulder, toward the harbor street where the two cloaked men still moved between shop fronts, drawing steadily closer to her own darkened door. "Then let's not stand here discussing it," she said, and quickened her pace toward the road leading out of Oakhaven. The postal carriage left Oakhaven an hour before sunrise, rattling out along the coast road with only 2 other passengers aboard, an elderly parson dozing against the window and a wool merchant counting coin under his breath. Corinna had chosen the earliest departure deliberately, reasoning that Thaddeus's men, however thorough, would not think to watch the postal yard before light. She kept the satchel with the cipher box pressed against her knees the entire ride, one hand resting on its strap, even as exhaustion pulled at her eyes. Gideon sat across from her, cap still low over his brow, watching the gray coastline give way to rolling farmland through the small carriage window. He had said little since Oakhaven, and Corinna found the silence stranger than his brandy-soaked confessions of the night before. A man who had once commanded a room without raising his voice now sat folded into the corner of a public coach, hands clasped tight enough that his knuckles had gone pale. "You needn't watch the road as though it might swallow you," she said finally, if only to break the quiet. "I'm not watching the road." He didn't look away from the window. "I'm thinking of the last time I saw you leave that house." Corinna's fingers tightened briefly on the satchel strap. "I'd rather not revisit that particular memory, if it's all the same to you." "It isn't all the same to me." He turned then, and the look on his face startled her. Not the careless charm she remembered from his younger years, nor the drunken desperation of the night before, but something steadier and more painful to witness. "I was in the room, Corinna, when my uncle accused you of falsifying the estate ledgers. I heard every word of it, and I said nothing. You were 23, and your father had only just handed you responsibility for the Eastern tenancies. What exactly did you imagine you could have done?" "I could have told the truth, that you'd refused Thaddeus outright when he asked you to alter those figures, not because you were dishonest, but because you were the only honest one left in that house." His jaw tightened. "Instead, I let him paint you as a thief who'd been caught and dismissed for it, and I told myself there would be a better moment to correct it. There never was, and you left Oakhaven's outskirts with your name in ruins, because I hadn't the courage to open my mouth." Corinna looked out the window, rather than at him, watching hedgerows blur past in the pale morning light. She had imagined this conversation 100 times over the past 3 years, had rehearsed a dozen bitter replies for the day Gideon Vance might finally offer an apology. Now that the moment had come, she found she had no appetite for cruelty, only a tired, aching honesty. "I won't pretend it didn't cost me," she said. "I lost 3 commissions within a month of leaving your uncle's household, all from families who'd heard some version of the story and didn't care to learn the truth of it. It took the better part of 2 years before decent folk in Oakhaven trusted me with anything finer than mending a kitchen clock." She finally turned back to him. "So no, Gideon, I won't tell you it didn't matter, but I didn't survive it by waiting for you to fix it. I survived it by working harder than anyone else in that town, until my name meant something again on my own terms. I know it, he said quietly. It's part of why I came to your door last night, and no one else's. Not only because you're the finest hand with a lock in this county, though you are, but because I trust you to tell me the truth, even when it costs me something to hear it. That's more than I can say for most people my uncles kept around me since my father died. Corina studied him a long moment, weighing the sincerity in his voice against 3 years of hard-won caution. Then hear this truth plainly, so there's no confusion between us for the remainder of this journey. I'm not doing this out of old affection, or because a night of brandy and desperation has stirred something forgiving in me. I'm doing this because that box may hold the only chance either of us has at setting the record straight. You, about your inheritance, and I, about my name. Name your terms then, Gideon said. Whatever you require, I'll see it done, once the estate is mine to command again. A formal document, she said, signed by the rightful heir, once your claim is settled, stating plainly that the accusations against me were false, and guaranteeing in writing that my workshop remains entirely independent of Vance family interest, now and for as long as I choose to run it. No obligations, no favors owed beyond what's written on that page. Gideon held her gaze without flinching. Done. You have my word, and you'll have it in ink the moment I'm able to provide it. Words are easily given, Corina said, though not unkindly. I'll trust the ink when I see it. The carriage rattled on through the morning, the coastal air giving way gradually to the thicker green smell of inland forest as the road climbed toward higher ground. The parson snored softly in his corner. The wool merchant had finally finished counting his coin and dozed off against the window frame. Corina allowed herself, for the first time since the knock at her door, to close her eyes, though sleep did not come easily, not with the satchel's weight against her knees and the knowledge that somewhere behind them, on this same road, men who served Lord Thaddeus were almost certainly closing the distance. Beside her, Gideon had gone quiet again, though this silence felt different from the one that had opened their journey. Lighter, perhaps, for having finally said what needed saying. Outside, the trees thickened into deep forest, and the carriage wheels began to labor against a road grown steadily rougher beneath them, jostling its passengers with every rut and stone, as though the land itself meant to test how far they still had left to travel. The carriage gave out just past midday, somewhere along a muddy forest road, with no village in sight, in either direction. Corina felt it before she heard it. A sudden lurch, a grinding crack beneath the floorboards, and then the whole coach tipped hard to one side as the driver hauled the horses to a shuddering stop. By the time she and Gideon climbed out into the cold, the driver was already crouched beside the rear wheel, swearing under his breath at a cracked iron axle that had no business surviving another mile, let alone the remainder of their journey inland. Blackwood's the nearest stop, the driver said, straightening with a grim look. An hour's walk, perhaps less if the road stays firm. I'll not risk this coach another furlong on that axle. Not with rain coming in behind us. There was little to be done but agree. The parson grumbled about lost time, and the wool merchant fretted over his goods, but Corina found she did not much mind the walk, muddy hem notwithstanding. It gave her a chance to study the road behind them, watching for any sign of riders, and she saw none, only bare fields and the gray line of forest closing in on either side. The Blackwood coaching inn turned out to be a low, timbered building set back from the road behind a stand of ash trees, its windows lit warm against the gathering dusk. The innkeeper, a broad woman with flowers still dusted across her apron, showed little interest in her guests, beyond collecting their coin and directing them toward whatever rooms remained above the taproom. Corinna took a small chamber at the end of the corridor, plain but private, with a narrow bed and a wooden desk set beneath a single shuttered window. Gideon took the room beside hers, though he appeared at her door within minutes of settling in, still wearing the borrowed dockworker's coat. "We've hours to spare before another coach passes through," he said. "I thought you might want the time." Corinna was already clearing the desk of its clutter. A cracked wash basin, a stub of unused candle, a folded shawl left by some previous guest and never reclaimed. She set the cipher box down in the space she'd made and drew her stool close, arranging her tools across a strip of cloth with the same careful order she gave every commission that crossed her workbench at home. "You may as well make yourself useful," she said, without looking up. "Light every candle this room has to offer. I'll not risk missing a hairline scratch in poor light and guessing wrong on a lock built to punish guessing." Gideon obeyed without complaint, working his way around the small room until 4 tallow candles burned steadily, their flickering light pooling across the desk and throwing long shadows against the timbered walls. Then he settled into the room's single armchair, close enough to watch, far enough not to crowd her hands. Corinna fitted her loupe into place and turned her full attention to the first barrel of the double lock. She had spent the carriage ride turning the mechanism over in her mind, piecing together what she'd observed that morning in her workshop, the tension of the outer gear ring, the faint resistance she'd felt when testing the first tumbler with the lightest touch of her pick. Her father had once told her that every lock, no matter how cunning its maker, carried some trace of the hand that built it. A signature, almost, hidden in the particular rhythm of its resistance. She worked in near silence for the better part of an hour, adjusting her pick by fractions so small they would have been invisible to any eye but her own, listening for the faint click of tumblers shifting beneath the brass casing. Twice she withdrew the pick entirely and sat back, breathing slowly, unwilling to rush past a resistance she didn't yet understand. Gideon said nothing through any of it, though she was aware of his eyes on her hands the entire time, steady and unmoving. At last, with a soft click that seemed far too small a sound for the tension it released, the outer gear ring gave way beneath her fingers and turned freely for the first time. Corinna sat back, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The first ring's disarmed. There's a second barrel beneath it, and likely a false tumbler built in to catch anyone careless enough to celebrate too soon, but the outer defense is clear. Gideon leaned forward, studying the small gap now visible where the ring had loosened. "I've watched skilled men work locks before. My father kept a locksmith on retainer for the estate's more delicate cabinets. I've never seen anyone work with your patience. Patience is the whole of the craft," Corinna said, setting down her pick to flex her cramped fingers. "Anyone can force a lock open. It takes a steadier hand to convince one to open on its own." "My uncle underestimated you badly," Gideon said quietly. "I think he always did. He saw a woman keeping her father's shop and assumed that was the whole measure of you, a tradeswoman, useful for winding the estate's clocks, and little else. He never once considered you might understand his ledgers better than his own accountants did, or that you'd refuse to falsify them even when threatened with your livelihood. He considered it enough to want me gone the moment I refused him," Corinna said. "That was measure enough of what he thought I was capable of." Gideon fell quiet at that, and for a moment the only sound in the room was the soft hiss of the candles and the distant murmur of voices rising from the taproom below. Corinna glanced at him, expecting to find embarrassment or apology in his face again, but found instead something closer to quiet admiration, the look of a man reconsidering, perhaps for the first time in years, exactly what he owed the people his family had so carelessly discarded. "There's a second barrel yet to disarm," she said, turning back to the box before the silence could stretch further. "And precious little time to finish it, before whatever rest this inn allows us runs out. Hold the candle steadier, if you please. I'll need every scrap of light you can give me." Corinna woke before dawn to the sound of boots in the corridor. She had fallen asleep at the desk some time past midnight, her head resting against her folded arms, the cipher box still sitting half disarmed beside her tools. For a moment, she couldn't place what had woken her. The inn was old, its floorboards prone to creaking under any weight. But then she heard it again, closer this time, the deliberate tread of more than one man, moving door to door along the corridor, pausing at each to knock and demand entry. She was on her feet at once, heart hammering, gathering her tools into their cloth roll with hands that shook only slightly. Through the thin wall she heard Gideon's door creak open in his own room, followed almost immediately by a voice she didn't recognize, clipped, formal, entirely too polite for the hour.
"Mr. Vance, is it? Forgive the early call."
"I represent your uncle's household, and I've reason to believe you're traveling with property belonging to the estate." Corinna went still, straining to listen. She recognized the tactic even before Gideon answered. A search dressed up as courtesy, the sort of soft-spoken threat men like Thaddeus's stewards were trained to deliver without ever raising their voice. If they searched Gideon's room and found nothing, her own door was next, and there would be no explaining away a half-open cipher box and a satchel full of lock-picking tools to a man conducting an official inquiry. She heard Gideon's voice, steady and unbothered, in a way she suspected cost him considerable effort. "You're welcome to look, Mr. Finch, though I confess I don't know what you imagine I've made off with. My uncle's paranoia has clearly outpaced his manners, sending men to root through a coaching inn before proper light." "My lord's instructions were explicit," Finch replied. "A full search of the premises, beginning with any guest who matches your description." Corinna didn't wait to hear more. She swept the last of her tools into the satchel, wrapped the cipher box hastily in its cloth, and pressed her ear to the door, listening for the moment the corridor might clear enough to move. It never came. Instead, she heard the unmistakable sound of a door being tried, not Gideon's, but hers, the latch rattling once before a firm knock followed. "A moment," she called out, forcing steadiness into her voice, praying it held. She had perhaps 30 seconds before whoever stood on the other side lost patience and forced the door regardless of whether she'd opened it herself. Then, from somewhere below, chaos erupted. She heard it before she understood it. A sudden explosion of noise from the inn's courtyard, horses screaming, hooves pounding against packed earth, a stable boy's startled shout, rising above the general uproar. Through her shuttered window she caught a glimpse of shapes moving fast across the yard below, horses loose from their stalls, scattering in every direction, one rearing hard enough to send a hitching post crashing to the ground. The corridor outside her door erupted into motion. She heard Finch's voice, sharp now and stripped of all its earlier courtesy, barking orders to the men with him, footsteps retreating fast toward the stairs. Beneath the noise, she caught one clear thread of sound that told her everything. Gideon's voice, distant now, shouting something about a loose gate latch, drawing every searching man in the building down into the yard after him. Corinna didn't waste the chance he'd bought her. She threw open her door the moment the corridor cleared, satchel slung across her chest, and moved fast toward the back stair the innkeeper had shown her the evening before, a narrow servant's passage, meant for carrying linens and firewood, entirely separate from the inn's main entrance. She took the steps 2 at a time, emerging into a small kitchen yard behind the building, cold morning air striking her face as she ducked low along the garden wall and out through a gap in the hedgerow beyond. The bridge Gideon had mentioned the night before, half in jest, half as precaution, stood perhaps a quarter-mile down the road, a narrow stone crossing over a shallow river swollen with recent rain. Corinna reached it breathless, satchel clutched tight against her ribs, and pressed herself into the shadow of its arch to wait, straining her ears for any sign of pursuit. Gideon arrived perhaps 10 minutes later, moving fast along the riverbank rather than the open road, his borrowed coat torn at one elbow and mud splashed halfway up his boots. "You're unhurt?" he asked, breathing hard, before she'd even fully stepped out from the shadow of the bridge. "Unhurt, and still in possession of everything that matters," Corinna said, patting the satchel. "Though I might ask the same of you. Releasing every horse in that stable yard was a bold way to buy me time. It was the fastest thing I could think of." A faint, exhausted smile crossed his face, despite everything. "Finch will have half the county's constables out looking for a madman who frightens innkeepers' horses before he thinks to look for a man searching for a locked box. He'll realize soon enough it was no accident. By then, I intend for us to be well beyond his reach." Gideon glanced back the way he'd come, toward the inn now hidden behind a rise of trees, smoke still curling faintly from its chimney into the pale morning sky. "There's an old toll house along this river, perhaps 2 miles further on, abandoned these 10 years past, since the new bridge upstream took the trade from it. We can shelter there long enough to finish what we started at the inn, without Finch or anyone else thinking to look." Corinna adjusted the satchel strap across her shoulder, feeling the weight of the cipher box settle against her hip once more. "Then we'd best not linger here discussing it. Every minute we spend admiring the view is a minute closer to your uncle's men finding this bridge as easily as they found that inn." Gideon nodded once, some of the earlier warmth fading back into grim determination. 2 miles, then, and Corinna. He hesitated, glancing at her with something almost apologetic in his expression. "Thank you. For trusting the noise in that yard enough to run when it mattered, rather than waiting to see what became of me first. I didn't run for you," Corinna said, already turning toward the river path. "I ran because that box is the only proof either of us has left. Sentiment can wait until we're somewhere safer than a bridge in open country." But even as she said it, some small, treacherous part of her noted that he had come back for her at all, chosen the risk of the courtyard over the certainty of his own escape, and she found she could not entirely dismiss what that meant, whatever she told herself about sentiment and safety. The toll house stood exactly where Gideon promised, a squat stone building hunched beside the river, with its roof half caved in on one side, and ivy creeping thick across the walls that still stood. The old collection window, once used to gather coin from carts crossing the river before the new bridge made it obsolete, hung open on a broken hinge, letting in a thin draft of cold morning air. Corinna judged it safe enough, abandoned long past any use, tucked far enough from the road that no casual searcher would think to look inside. She cleared a space on the toll house's stone counter, the same surface where some long-forgotten keeper had once collected fares, and set the cipher box down beneath the light, spilling through the broken roof. Her hands ached from the previous night's work, cramped and stiff, but she forced herself to steady them before reaching for her tools again. "The second barrel's the difficult one," she said, more to herself than to Gideon, who had taken up a watchful position near the collection window, eyes fixed on the tree line beyond. "The first ring was clever, but built to slow an amateur. This one feels different." Deliberate in a way that suggests your father wanted more than a lock. He wanted a test. A test. Gideon glanced back at her. What sort? The kind that requires knowing something about the man who built it, not merely skill with a pick. When she turned the box slowly, studying the second barrel's face through her loupe. Where the first had been governed by tension and touch, this one bore a series of small dials set into the brass, each etched with faint numerals worn smooth from age. This wants a sequence. Numbers, likely, though I can't yet say what determines their order. Gideon crossed the room and crouched beside her, studying the dials with a frown of concentration that reminded her, unexpectedly, of the serious boy she'd once known before his father sent him off to be educated among gentlemen who taught him to hide such earnestness behind easy charm. My father loved riddles. He'd set them for me as a boy, hidden in verses he made me memorize before he'd tell me what they meant. He paused, something shifting behind his eyes. There was one poem he read to me more than any other, about a ship, long overdue, waiting on tides that never quite arrived on schedule. Do you remember it? Every word. He made certain of that. Gideon closed his eyes briefly, and when he spoke again, it was in the low, steady cadence of recitation. A poem about a captain counting days against the moon, numbers threaded through every stanza. 3 ships, 7 tides, 12 bells before the dawn watch changed. Corinna listened with growing certainty, matching each number he spoke against the dials before her. 3, 7, 12. She turned the first dial to align with the third numeral, watched it click faintly into place, then moved to the second. Say it again, she said, slower this time. I want to be certain I've caught every figure before I risk turning the final dial. Gideon repeated the poem, and this time Corinna followed each line, with her fingers hovering over the dials, adjusting them one by one as the numbers emerged from the verse. 3, 7, 12. And finally, buried in the poem's closing stanza, a 4th number she'd nearly missed entirely. 9. The hour the captain's ship was said to finally return home. She turned the last dial to 9, the box released with a soft mechanical sigh, gears shifting audibly beneath the lid before it eased open on its own. No force required. Corinna sat back, breathing out slowly, aware of how close her hands had been trembling throughout the whole careful process. Inside lay a folded document, sealed with wax, bearing the Vance family crest, and beneath it, a smaller leather-bound journal, its pages soft with age and frequent handling. Gideon reached for the sealed document first, hands unsteady, as he broke the wax and unfolded it. Corinna watched his face as he read, the tension in his shoulders slowly giving way to something between disbelief and grief. "It's genuine," he said quietly. "My father's true will, signed and witnessed a full year before his death, naming me his sole and rightful heir, with no conditions attached beyond what any son might reasonably expect." He looked up at her, eyes bright with something he seemed to be fighting hard to master. Thaddeus's document was a fabrication from the first line. And the journal? Gideon set the will carefully aside and opened the leather-bound book instead, turning through pages dense with his father's cramped, careful handwriting. Corinna leaned closer, reading over his shoulder as he traced one entry after another, figures recorded against dates, notes in the margins questioning discrepancies in the estate's reported debts, a growing suspicion documented month by month in his father's own hand. He knew, Gideon said, voice tightening. He suspected Thaddeus was falsifying the estate's accounts for years before he died, inflating debts against tenant lands, pocketing the difference through false repairs and phantom improvements never actually made. There are entries here, going back 3 years at least. He turned another page, and his breath caught. "Corinna, look at this." She followed his finger to an entry dated only weeks before his father's death, describing a meeting with a tradeswoman from Oakhaven who had refused to falsify certain ledger figures on Thaddeus's instruction, a refusal, his father had written, that spoke well of her character, whatever lies his brother might spread to cover his own dishonesty afterward. Corinna stared at the entry a long moment, something tightening in her throat that she hadn't expected. He knew the truth. Even then, before I'd left the estate for good, he knew I hadn't lied. He always suspected Thaddeus of far more than he let on, Gideon said quietly. I think now he was building this evidence deliberately, gathering proof before he trusted anyone enough to act on it. He simply ran out of time before he could see it through himself. Corinna closed the journal gently, the weight of its pages settling something in her chest she hadn't realized needed settling. Proof, finally, that her name had never truly been in question, not to the one man in that family whose judgment had actually mattered. "Then we'll finish what he started," she said, "whatever it costs either of us from here." Gideon met her eyes, something resolute hardening in his expression. The magistrate's office lies across the Viridian River, in the county seat. If we reach it before Thaddeus completes the estate transfer, there may yet be time to stop him properly, in front of witnesses who can't be bought or silenced. "Then we'd best not waste what daylight remains standing here," Corinna said, already reaching for the cloth to wrap the will and journal safely alongside her tools. "Your uncle's men found us at an inn a mile from nowhere. I doubt a river will slow them for long." The road to Viridian Crossing ran along high ground above the river, and it was there, cresting a low hill with the water glinting below, that Gideon first spotted the riders. 3 of them, moving at a steady trot along the main road toward the bridge, too far to make out faces, but close enough that the shape of their traveling cloaks matched exactly what Corinna had seen from her window in Oakhaven 3 days before. She felt her stomach drop, even as Gideon pulled her back behind a hedge, both of them crouching low until the riders passed out of sight around a bend. "They've beaten us to the bridge," Gideon said, low and grim. "Finch must have sent word ahead the moment he realized we'd slipped him at Blackwood. If they're watching the crossing, we'll be seen the instant we approach it." Corinna studied the river below, tracing its course with her eyes, until it disappeared behind a stand of willows further downstream. "Then we don't cross where they expect us to." They found the ferryman's cottage a half-mile further along the bank, a low structure with a small wooden skiff drawn up on the mud beside it. The ferryman himself, a weathered man with forearms thick from years of rowing against the current, listened to Gideon's request with open suspicion, clearly unconvinced that 2 travelers on foot, mud-splashed and hollow-eyed with exhaustion, had any pressing business worth a private crossing. "The bridge is a mile upstream," he said, folding his arms. "Free passage, and a good deal less trouble for an old man's back than rowing 2 strangers across in this current. We'd prefer not to use the bridge," Gideon said carefully. The ferryman's eyes narrowed further, and Corinna could see the negotiations slipping away from them before it had properly begun. Then Gideon reached into his coat and drew out his pocket watch, silver, finely made, the sort of piece that marked its owner as a gentleman even beneath a dockworker's borrowed coat. He held it out without hesitation. "This is worth considerably more than a few coins," Gideon said. "It's yours, in exchange for a crossing now and your silence afterward, should anyone come asking whether you've ferried travelers today." The ferryman took the watch, turned it over once in his weathered palm, and seemed to reconsider his objections entirely. "Silence costs extra," he said, though the edge had gone out of his voice. but I expect this covers it well enough. Climb aboard, the both of you. The current's strong past the second bend, so keep low and hold to the sides. The skiff proved smaller than Corinna had hoped, low in the water and prone to rocking with every shift of weight, but the ferryman handled the oars with practiced ease, guiding them out into the current with steady, unhurried strokes. She kept the satchel pressed tight against her chest, watching the far bank draw slowly closer, while the ferryman's cottage shrank behind them. Gideon sat close beside her, near enough that she could feel the tension still coiled through him, despite the relative safety of open water. "That watch belonged to my father," he said quietly, watching the river slide past. "He gave it to me the day I came of age. I imagine he'd find it fitting, in a strange way, that it bought us safe passage while carrying his own justice across this river." "You didn't hesitate," Corinna said. "Most men would have haggled over a thing like that, sentiment or no. Sentiment is a poor currency against men my uncle's paying to find us." Gideon's gaze shifted to her, steady, despite the skiff's gentle rocking beneath them. "Besides, I've had a great deal of time these past days to consider what actually matters and what doesn't. A watch can be replaced. What that box carries cannot." Corinna said nothing for a moment, watching the water churn white where it broke against a half-submerged rock. When she finally spoke, it was quieter than she'd intended. "You've changed since Oakhaven 3 years ago." "I don't say that lightly. I hope I have." He was quiet a moment, then added, "I've thought of little else these past days, besides what I owe you, beyond the terms we agreed on the carriage. A document restoring your name is the least I can offer, given what my family cost you." "But I want to do more than the least, Corinna. Once this is settled." "Such as?" "There's no proper guild hall for horologists in this county," he said. "Every serious tradesman in your craft travels to the capital to train, or to have their finest work judged by anyone who understands its worth. I mean to fund one, once the estate is restored to me, a hall built and named for you, where any craftsman with real skill can train and be judged fairly, regardless of what family they were born into, or what gossip's been spread about their character." Corinna turned to look at him fully, startled by the specificity of it, the sense that he'd thought this through rather than offering some vague, easily forgotten promise born of guilt and gratitude. "That's no small undertaking." "No," Gideon agreed. "But it's an honest one, and long overdue besides. My father valued craftsmanship above nearly everything else he owned. I think he'd have approved of using what he left behind to build something lasting from all of this, rather than simply reclaiming what was taken." The skiff bumped gently against the far bank before Corinna could answer, the ferryman already shipping his oars and calling out something about the current growing stronger further downstream. Best they disembark quickly while the mud still held firm underfoot. Gideon climbed out first, offering her his hand across the gap between skiff and bank, and Corinna took it, steadying herself as she stepped onto solid ground once more. "We'll speak more of guild halls once your uncle's stripped of everything he's stolen," she said, though something in her chest had loosened at the promise, warmer than she cared to examine too closely just then. "For now, the county seat lies how far from here? A half-day's walk, if we keep a steady pace and avoid the main roads." Gideon glanced back across the river, toward the ferryman already rowing back toward his cottage, watch tucked safely away. "Vance Manor lies nearer still, and the family council convenes there tomorrow morning for the annual estate audit. If we reach it before the meeting concludes, we'll have every witness who matters gathered in one room, unable to pretend afterward they hadn't seen the truth with their own eyes." Corinna adjusted the satchel's strap and fell into step beside him, the county seat's distant spires just visible now against the gray afternoon sky. Then we'd best not waste the daylight we've paid so dearly to earn. They reached Vance Manor as the last light was fading from the sky, having abandoned the idea of the county seat entirely, somewhere along the afternoon's walk. Gideon had argued the point plainly enough that Corinna found little to dispute. A magistrate unfamiliar with the Vance family's history might delay for weeks, demanding further proof, weighing testimony against testimony, while Thaddeus finished securing the estate transfer in the meantime. The family council, gathered for its annual audit, offered no such luxury of delay. Every trustee who mattered, along with the senior county executor himself, would be under one roof by morning, whether they wished to be confronted with the truth or not. The manor rose before them out of the dusk exactly as Corinna remembered it, though smaller somehow than the place that had loomed so large in her memory these past 3 years. Gray stone softened by ivy along its western wing, tall windows already lit against the coming dark. She felt an old, unwelcome tightness settle in her chest at the sight of it, the same feeling she'd carried the day she'd walked away from its gates, for what she'd believed then was the last time. "You're certain of this?" she said quietly, as they crouched behind a low stone wall bordering the estate's eastern grounds. "Walking back into the house that cast you out, uninvited, with nothing but a box and a journal to your name. I'm certain there's no better proof than catching Thaddeus in front of the very people he means to deceive," Gideon said. "A magistrate's court would take his word against mine for weeks before deciding whose account carried more weight. The council already knows him. They've watched him these past years, even if they've said nothing. I think, given proof enough, they'll believe what they've likely suspected all along." He led her along the wall's edge, keeping low, until they reached a gate set into the garden's far boundary, half hidden behind an overgrown hedge that Corinna suspected hadn't been properly trimmed since her own days working within these grounds. Gideon worked the latch with practiced ease, clearly still familiar with every forgotten corner of the estate he'd grown up in, and led her through into the darkened conservatory beyond. The glass-paned room stood empty at this hour, its rows of potted ferns and dormant winter roses casting long shadows across the tiled floor. Corinna followed close behind Gideon as he moved through it with quiet confidence, past a second door leading into a narrow servants' corridor, and finally into a book-lined library adjoining the estate's main council chamber. "We'll wait here," he murmured, easing the library door shut behind them. "The council won't convene until morning. If we're fortunate, no one will think to search this room before then." Corinna settled into a worn leather chair near the cold hearth, setting the satchel carefully across her lap, unwilling to let it out of arm's reach even now. The library smelled of old paper and beeswax polish, familiar in a way that unsettled her more than she expected. She had spent hours in this very room once, cataloging timepieces for the estate's collection before everything had gone wrong between her and this family. "Does it trouble you?" she asked, watching Gideon pace slowly along the shelves. "Being back here at all? Whatever proof we carry, this was still your father's house. Your uncle's taken more from you than an inheritance these past weeks." Gideon paused near the window, looking out into the darkened grounds beyond. "It troubles me more than I've let on, if I'm honest. I keep expecting to hear my father's voice somewhere down the corridor, calling me in to review the tenant accounts before supper, the way he did every evening for years. It's a strange grief, coming back to a house so full of him and finding only Thaddeus's presence stamped over everything instead." "Grief rarely arrives conveniently," Corinna said. It comes whether we've time to properly feel it or not. No, he agreed. It doesn't. He turned from the window, something quieter, settling into his expression. I've had little chance to simply grieve him properly, between the funeral and the forged will, and everything since. I imagine that reckoning will come for me eventually, once all of this is finished, whether I'm prepared for it or not. And when it does, Corinna said, surprising herself with the gentleness in her own voice, I hope you'll allow yourself the time it deserves, rather than burying it beneath estate business the moment the council rules in your favor. Gideon looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded passing across his face, before he seemed to catch himself and glance away toward the shelves again, as though searching for composure among the spines of his father's old books. You've a way of saying exactly what I need to hear, whether I care to hear it or not. It's a habit my father complained of often enough, Corinna said, allowing herself the smallest smile. He said I'd never make a proper tradeswoman, speaking my mind so plainly to customers who only wanted their clocks fixed and their opinions left unchallenged. I think it's precisely why you've made such a fine one, Gideon said. Any craftsman can polish brass until it shines. Far fewer have the honesty to tell a client the truth about what's actually broken. They settled into a watchful quiet after that, taking turns through the long hours of the night to rest against the library's worn furniture, while the other kept watch at the door, listening for any sign of movement in the corridor beyond. Somewhere past midnight, Corinna woke briefly to find Gideon seated near the cold hearth, journal open across his knees, tracing his father's handwriting by the thin moonlight filtering through the library window, his expression unreadable in the darkness. She did not disturb him. Some griefs, she understood, needed to be sat with alone, however briefly, before morning arrived and demanded everything of him all over again. The council chamber filled slowly through the early morning hours, voices drifting through the library wall as trustees and estate officials arrived, one by one, exchanging the polite, weary courtesies of men gathering for business they'd rather have finished quickly. Corinna listened from behind the closed door, cataloging each new arrival by voice alone, until finally she heard the one voice she'd been dreading and waiting for in equal measure. Lord Thaddeus Vance entered the chamber with the easy confidence of a man who believed the matter already settled in his favor. "Gentlemen, if we might begin," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the thin wall separating library from council chamber. "There's a great deal to review before the transfer documents are finalized, and I'd rather not keep the executor waiting longer than necessary." A second voice answered, older and more measured. The senior county executor himself, Corinna guessed, a man whose approval would carry weight enough to settle the matter beyond any further dispute. "Quite right, my lord. Though I confess, I'd hoped your nephew might be present for these proceedings, given the significance of what's being decided." "My nephew," Thaddeus said, with a faint note of practiced regret, "has been indisposed these past weeks. Grief affects men in different ways, executor, and I fear my brother's death has struck Gideon rather harder than any of us anticipated. I've had reports of him drinking heavily, disappearing from decent society entirely. It grieves me to say it, but I question whether he's presently fit to manage the responsibilities this estate requires." Beside her, Corinna felt Gideon go rigid, jaw tight with barely restrained fury at hearing his own grief twisted so casually into evidence against him. She placed a hand briefly on his arm, a silent reminder to hold his composure a moment longer, and felt him exhale slowly beneath her touch. "Now," she whispered. Gideon nodded once, straightened his borrowed coat as best he could, and crossed to the library door. Corinna followed close behind, satchel clutched against her side, as he pushed through into the council chamber with a steadiness that betrayed nothing of the exhaustion carried in every line of his body. The room fell silent at once. A dozen faces turned toward the doorway, trustees seated around a long mahogany table, the executor at its head, and Thaddeus standing near the fireplace with a document already spread before him, pen in hand, as though the transfer required only his signature to complete. Gideon. Thaddeus recovered his composure quickly, though not before Corinna caught the brief flash of alarm crossing his face. "How gratifying to see you well enough to attend, given the reports I've received of your condition these past weeks. The reports were greatly exaggerated, Uncle, as I suspect you know better than anyone in this room." Gideon's voice carried clean and steady across the chamber, none of the roughness that had marked his voice at Corinna's door days before. "Forgive the state of my dress. I've spent the better part of a week proving what you've spent considerably longer trying to bury." Thaddeus's eyes flicked toward Corinna, recognition dawning slowly, followed by something colder. "And you've brought company. A tradeswoman, if I recall correctly, dismissed from this household some years ago for falsifying estate records, unless my memory fails me." "Your memory serves you exactly as poorly as it did 3 years ago," Corinna said, stepping forward before Gideon could answer for her. "I was dismissed for refusing to falsify them, my lord, at your own instruction, a distinction you understood perfectly well at the time, whatever version of events you've told since." A murmur passed through the seated trustees. The executor leaned forward slightly, attention sharpening. "This is a serious accusation, madam, one I trust you're prepared to substantiate, given the company you keep it in." "I am." Corinna crossed to the long table and set the satchel down, drawing out the cipher box and placing it before the assembled council with deliberate care. She opened the lid fully, revealing the interior compartment where the vial had once sat, now emptied and rendered harmless. This box was left by the late Lord Vance, sealed with a lock designed to test the patience and skill of whoever sought to open it. It contained 2 documents. I'd ask the executor to examine both. She withdrew the sealed will first, laying it before him, followed by the leather-bound journal. Thaddeus's face had gone pale, though he maintained a thin veneer of composure, gripping the edge of the fireplace mantel as the executor broke the wax seal and began to read. The chamber remained silent through the long minutes that followed, broken only by the rustle of pages, as the executor moved from the will to the journal, comparing signatures, examining the balance wheel mechanism Corinna had set beside the documents as further proof of the box's authenticity. She watched his expression shift gradually from cautious skepticism to something graver, jaw tightening as he read further into the journal's careful accounting of falsified debts and phantom repairs. "This is my brother's signature," the executor finally said, looking up. "I've witnessed it on enough documents these past 20 years to know it beyond doubt. And this journal," he turned to Thaddeus directly, voice hardening. "This journal details a pattern of financial deception spanning years, my lord. Falsified tenant debts, repairs invoiced but never performed, sums drawn against the estate's accounts and unaccounted for entirely. Fabrications," Thaddeus said, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence entirely. "Anyone might forge a journal, executor, particularly a tradeswoman skilled enough to open a lock, built to resist exactly that kind of deception. The handwriting matches decades of correspondence I've received from your late brother personally," the executor said flatly, "and this will bears witness signatures from 2 men still living in this county, easily consulted before the day is out, should you wish to challenge its authenticity further." He set the document down with a finality that seemed to settle over the entire room. "I've seen enough, my lord. The will you presented at the reading was false, and I suspect you knew it from the first moment you produced it." Thaddeus said nothing, his silence answer enough for everyone gathered at that table. Corinna glanced at Gideon, standing straight and steady beside her despite everything, and felt something settle in her own chest at last. Not quite relief, not yet, but the first genuine sense that the truth, so carefully protected across so many miles and so much danger, had finally found the room where it mattered most. The executor rose from his chair, and the weight of authority in the gesture alone seemed enough to silence whatever protest Thaddeus had been gathering to offer. "Lord Thaddeus Vance," he said, his voice carrying the formal gravity of a man who had spent decades presiding over matters exactly like this one. Though rarely with stakes so personal to the family involved, in light of the evidence presented, I am satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that the will you submitted following your brother's death was a deliberate forgery, and that you have, for a period of several years, at minimum, systematically falsified this estate's financial records for your own gain. Thaddeus's composure finally cracked entirely. "You cannot simply—" "I can, and I will," the executor said, cutting through the protest without raising his voice. "You are stripped, effective immediately, of all administrative authority over this estate and its holdings. The falsified accounts, detailed in this journal, will be forwarded to the circuit court for full examination, and you will present yourself there to answer for them, as any man accused of such conduct must." He turned toward the trustees seated around the table, several of whom had begun murmuring among themselves with expressions ranging from shock to grim satisfaction. "I trust the council has no objection to Mr. Gideon Vance assuming his rightful position, given the authenticity of his father's true will." No objection came. Corinna watched several of the trustees rise from their seats entirely, crossing to Gideon with murmured congratulations and apologies both, men who had clearly harbored their own private suspicions about Thaddeus these past years, but lacked the proof to act on them. Thaddeus himself said nothing further, his face drained of all its earlier confidence, as two of the household stewards, at the executor's quiet instruction, moved to escort him from the chamber. He paused once at the doorway, looking back, not at Gideon, but at Corinna, standing quietly beside the cipher box, with the journal still open on the table before her. "You always were more trouble than my brother gave you credit for," he said, low enough that only she and Gideon caught the words. "Your brother gave me exactly the credit I deserved," Corinna said evenly. "It was only ever you who couldn't stand to admit it." Thaddeus said nothing further. He turned and left the chamber without another glance, the stewards falling into step behind him, and the heavy door swung shut with a sound that seemed to settle something final over the entire room. The council dispersed gradually after that, trustees filing out to spread word of what had transpired, the executor remaining behind to finalize the paperwork restoring Gideon to his father's title and holdings. Corinna found herself standing near the cold fireplace as the chamber slowly emptied, exhaustion finally catching up to her now that the danger had passed, 3 days of flight and sleepless nights settling into her limbs all at once. Gideon crossed to her once the last of the trustees had gone, something in his posture looser than she'd seen it since that first desperate knock at her workshop door. "It's done," he said quietly. "Truly done. I confess I hadn't quite let myself believe it would end this cleanly, not until I watched Thaddeus walk out that door. Nothing about the past week has been clean," Corinna said, though she found herself smiling despite the ache in her shoulders. "But I'll allow the ending qualifies, whatever came before it." Gideon reached into his coat and drew out a folded sheet of paper the executor had provided before departing, a formal document already bearing the estate seal, prepared hastily but with every proper signature required to make it binding. "I asked him to draft this before he left," he said, offering it to her. "I didn't want to give you cause to doubt my word a second longer than necessary." Corinna unfolded it carefully, reading through language that restored her name entirely, a formal acknowledgement that the accusations against her 3 years prior had been baseless, along with a binding guarantee of her workshop's independence from any future Vance family interference, exactly as she'd demanded on that carriage ride days before. "There's something further, beneath the seal," Gideon said, watching her read. "A second clause, added this morning while you slept. Funding, set aside from the estate's own accounts, for the construction of a guild hall in Oakhaven, one that will bear your name, as I promised you on the river." Corinna looked up at him, throat tight, in a way she hadn't quite expected. "You didn't need to see that finished so quickly. There's an entire estate to set right first, Gideon, debts to untangle, tenants to reassure, a title to properly assume." "I know it," he said, "but I've learned this past week that promises made and not kept cost a great deal more than the trouble of keeping them. I'd rather begin as I intend to continue." She folded the document carefully, tucking it into the satchel alongside her tools, and allowed herself, for the first time since Oakhaven, to simply stand still without calculating the next danger they might need to outrun. "What will you do now, with all of this restored to you? Rebuild, I expect. Properly this time, without my uncle's shadow hanging over every decision." Gideon studied her a moment, something more careful entering his expression. "And I find myself hoping, though I've no right to ask it of you so soon after everything you've endured on my account, that Oakhaven and this estate needn't remain quite so separate as they've been these past 3 years." Corinna considered him a long moment, the man who had once cost her everything through cowardly silence, transformed now into someone who had walked through storm and pursuit and grief itself to see the truth properly told. "I've a workshop to return to," she said finally, "and commissions waiting that won't finish themselves." "But Oakhaven isn't so very far from here, Gideon. Should a lord ever find reason to visit a tradeswoman's shop on legitimate business?" Something eased in his face, warm and unguarded, in a way she hadn't seen, since long before either of them had learned what his family was truly capable of. "Then, I expect," he said, "I shall find reason often enough." Outside the tall windows of Vance Manor, the morning light had fully broken over the grounds at last, gold and steady across grass still damp with the night's dew, the kind of light that seemed, after everything, to promise a beginning rather than merely marking an ending.